Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. There are some families you can research for days and still find nothing more than land deeds, census records, and wedding announcements in the local paper. But then there are others, families where the paper trail feels deliberately broken, where the few surviving photographs seem posed to hide more than they reveal. You'll notice the same eyes repeating from generation to generation, the same narrow jawline, the same way the children look eerily like their uncles and aunts, and you'll start to wonder, how close was this family really? This is the story of one such family. It begins in a dying coal town in the Appalachian Mountains, where the winters were long and the valleys too deep for sunlight to properly reach. A place where every house seemed to have its curtains drawn, and where, even in the 1960s, people still kept a small graveyard in the backyard. The family at the center of it had been there for over a century, never moving, never marrying outsiders. Their name carried weight, but also a quiet, unspoken fear. No one asked questions, and if you did, the older folks would simply shake their heads and say, "That's their business." The man I'm going to tell you about grew up in that family. His name was Thomas. For most of his life, he believed his father was just that, a father. He remembered him as a stern man, rarely speaking, always keeping to the shadows of their old farmhouse. But as the years passed, little cracks began to form in the story he'd been told. People in town would sometimes pause when they heard his last name, giving a slow, knowing nod before changing the subject. And in the family Bible, kept locked in a wooden chest, he once found something that would haunt him for decades, his own birth recorded twice under two different fathers. It wasn't until he turned 32 and an argument with his mother spiraled into an admission she could never take back that Thomas finally learned the truth. The man he had called father his whole life was also his half-brother. Thomas didn't speak for nearly a minute after hearing those words. His mother stood at the kitchen sink, her back to him, the faucet running as if the sound of water could drown out the confession. She didn't turn to face him. Instead, she kept her hands submerged, scrubbing at an already clean plate, her shoulders trembling in a way that told him she had been waiting years for this moment, both fearing and needing it to come. The truth, she explained, had been set in motion long before either of them was born. In the hills where their family lived, isolation was not a choice, but a condition of survival. The roads were bad, the winters worse, and strangers were regarded with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for thieves. Marrying within the family wasn't talked about openly, but it was done often enough that people stopped questioning it. It was a way to keep the land in the blood, as his grandfather used to say, a phrase that carried a strange, almost ceremonial weight. Thomas's grandfather, a cold and towering man known for keeping ledgers on every birth and death in the family, had fathered children with two women, sisters. One of those children was Thomas's father. The other was his mother. That made the man he had called Dad not only his father, but also his half-brother. The more his mother spoke, the more the walls of the kitchen seemed to close in around him. She told him about the night she was taken from her room at 15, the family meeting the next day where no one said a word, the way the church elders prayed over the family in private but never spoke of it in public. And she told him something even more unsettling, how when he was born, the midwife refused to sign the official papers until she was paid extra to forget certain details. Thomas realized then why there were so few photographs from his childhood, why his dad always kept a certain distance in public, why his mother avoided town gatherings altogether. He began to see his entire life in reverse, every memory shifting into a new and horrifying light. When he asked her why she had told him now, her answer was simple and cold. Because one day, someone else is going to tell you, and they won't love you when they do. In the weeks that followed, Thomas moved through life like a man underwater, hearing the muffled sounds of the world but unable to truly surface. He began digging quietly at first, pulling out old boxes from the attic and searching through yellowed newspaper clippings, family photographs, and brittle birth certificates. What he found didn't just confirm his mother's confession, it revealed a web so tangled that he began to question whether anyone in his bloodline had ever truly been a stranger to the others. The family tree was less a tree and more a circle, names looping back upon themselves, cousins marrying cousins, uncles becoming fathers to their nieces. Some generations blurred entirely, their records almost intentionally obscured, as if someone had been rewriting history from inside the house. He even found instances where a child's official father was listed as a man who had died years before their birth, a cover story the family must have assumed no one would check. Thomas also learned about a tradition whispered only among the oldest living relatives. It was called keeping the fire, a phrase that outsiders might mistake for something poetic. In reality, it referred to ensuring that the family's blood, and only the family's blood, continued to warm the hearth for generations. To marry outside was to let the fire die. Those who defied this unspoken law found themselves exiled, their names erased from the family Bible, their photographs burned in the kitchen stove. One name in particular stood out to him, a woman named Ruth, a cousin who had fled the mountains in the 1930s and was never mentioned again. According to a faded clipping he found in a forgotten scrapbook, Ruth had married a man from the city, but in the same year she had also been found dead in a river miles from her home. The local paper called it an accident. Thomas didn't believe it. The deeper he went, the more he realized his own existence was not a mistake, not a tragedy of chance, but the result of a system deliberately maintained, protected, and enforced. He wasn't an outlier. He was the latest in a long, unbroken chain. And chains, he thought, are meant to bind. It was around this time that Thomas began to notice the way certain people in town still watched him, eyes narrowing just slightly, heads tilting as though they were seeing something familiar in his face. These weren't friendly glances, they were measuring looks, the kind people give when they're quietly confirming a suspicion. One evening, he was at the only diner in town when an old man shuffled in, the kind of wiry, weathered figure who seemed older than the mountains themselves. The man sat across from him without asking and, after a long silence, muttered, "You're James's boy." Thomas started to correct him, to say that James had been his father's brother, but then he caught the way the old man's eyes hardened, like a dare. "Doesn't matter which name you use," the man said, "it's all the same blood." That sentence lingered with Thomas for days. He began to suspect that the truth about his family wasn't hidden from the townspeople at all. It was simply ignored, like a smell that everyone had learned to breathe through. Outsiders might not have known, but here, in this valley, people had always known, and by saying nothing, they had protected it. As autumn bled into winter, Thomas's sleep grew restless. He started having vivid dreams, walking down the hallway of the farmhouse as a boy, hearing muffled voices behind closed doors, feeling the floorboards bend under the weight of unseen figures. Sometimes, in the dreams, the voices would stop when he approached, replaced by a heavy silence that made his skin crawl. He'd wake up with his chest tight, as though someone had been standing over him while he slept. Driven by equal parts anger and curiosity, he decided to confront one of the oldest living relatives still in the valley, his great-aunt Margaret. She was 93 and nearly blind, but her memory was sharp in the way that mattered. When Thomas asked her about the family's history, she didn't deny anything. Instead, she told him that in their bloodline, the roles of father, brother, son, and cousin had never been fixed. "We don't see it the way the world sees it," she said. "We see it the way God gave it to us." When Thomas asked her if she thought what had happened to his mother was wrong, Margaret simply smiled and said, "What happens in the family is the family's blessing, and blessings aren't for outsiders to judge." In the weeks that followed, Thomas moved through life like a man underwater, hearing the muffled sounds of the world but unable to truly surface. He began digging, quietly at first, pulling out old boxes from the attic and searching through yellowed newspaper clippings, family photographs, and brittle birth certificates. What he found didn't just confirm his mother's confession, it revealed a web so tangled that he began to question whether anyone in his bloodline had ever truly been a stranger to the others. The family tree was less a tree and more a circle, names looping back upon themselves, cousins marrying cousins, uncles becoming fathers to their nieces. Some generations blurred entirely, their records almost intentionally obscured, as if someone had been rewriting history from inside the house. He even found instances where a child's official father was listed as a man who had died years before their birth, a cover story the family must have assumed no one would check. Thomas also learned about a tradition whispered only among the oldest living relatives. It was called keeping the fire, a phrase that outsiders might mistake for something poetic. In reality, it referred to ensuring that the family's blood, and only the family's blood, continued to warm the hearth for generations. To marry outside was to let the fire die. Those who defied this unspoken law found themselves exiled, their names erased from the family Bible, their photographs burned in the kitchen stove. One name in particular stood out to him, a woman named Ruth, a cousin who had fled the mountains in the 1930s and was never mentioned again. According to a faded clipping he found in a forgotten scrapbook, Ruth had married a man from the city, but in the same year she had also been found dead in a river miles from her home. The local paper called it an accident. Thomas didn't believe it. The deeper he went, the more he realized his own existence was not a mistake, not a tragedy of chance, but the result of a system deliberately maintained, protected, and enforced. He wasn't an outlier. He was the latest in a long, unbroken chain. And chains, he thought, are meant to bind. Thomas decided he needed to find whoever sent the letter. He started with the post office in the neighboring county, asking if anyone remembered a plain envelope mailed in the last month. The clerk gave him nothing but a blank look and a polite shake of the head. It was a dead end, until he noticed a corkboard near the exit covered in community flyers. One of them was for a church revival service, hosted by a congregation he had never heard of. The location was scribbled in pen at the bottom, an abandoned schoolhouse on the edge of the valley. On the night of the revival, Thomas drove out there. The building was lit from within by the dim glow of oil lamps. Through a crack in the warped wooden door, he saw a dozen faces, most of them middle-aged or older, sitting in a circle, and as he scanned them his stomach dropped. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same angular faces, the same deep-set eyes. These were his relatives, but not the ones who stayed in the open. A woman in the circle began speaking in a low, trembling voice, confessing how she had been given to a family member at 14. Another man followed, describing the same twisted family laws Thomas had heard from Margaret, but here the tone was different. These weren't proud recollections. They were stories spoken through clenched jaws, as though each word was both a release and a curse. Then, a man in the back stood up and locked eyes with Thomas through the crack in the door. Thomas froze. The man's expression shifted, recognition, then warning. He walked to the door, opened it slowly, and whispered, "You shouldn't be here. Not yet." Before Thomas could ask anything, the man pressed a folded sheet of paper into his hand and closed the door behind him. Back in his truck, Thomas unfolded the note. It was a list of names, dozens of them, spanning nearly 100 years. Some were crossed out in red ink, otet, hers circled. His own name was there, circled twice. That night he barely slept. He realized the letter hadn't been an invitation, it had been a test. And now, they knew he was looking. Winter came hard that year, sealing the valley in ice and shadow. Thomas kept the list hidden in the lining of his jacket, taking it out only when he was alone, tracing the names with his finger, wondering which of them were still alive and which were buried in unmarked graves on family land. The crossed-out names haunted him most. Were they dead or simply erased like Ruth had been? One night, he drove up the old mining road toward the ridge, a place he remembered from childhood as the highest point in the valley. From there, the town's few lights looked like fireflies trapped in glass. He thought about the generations who had lived and died here, bound by rules no one outside would understand or forgive. The weight of it was crushing. The truth wasn't just his burden, it was a net thrown over the entire community. And in that net, everyone had learned to stay still, to avoid drawing attention, to breathe quietly in the dark. But Thomas had already moved. He'd looked too closely, asked too many questions. Someone, maybe many someones, would want to stop that. The last time he saw his mother, she stood in the doorway of the farmhouse, her hair lit silver by the moon. She didn't ask where he was going. She only said, "If you leave, you can't come back. And if you stay, you won't leave again." He wanted to ask her if she regretted anything, if she ever wished she had been born somewhere else, to someone else, but he knew the answer before the words reached his lips. He left that night, taking only the list and the clothes on his back. He drove until the mountains flattened and the air smelled of salt instead of pine. Still, even miles from the valley, he could feel it, like an invisible thread pulling at the base of his skull. The bloodline doesn't let go. Years later, a package arrived at his apartment. No return address. Inside was a photograph of a newborn child, still waddled in a faded quilt Thomas recognized instantly. On the back, written in the same block letters as before, was a single line. "It's still burning," and Thomas knew, no matter how far he had run, the fire had followed him.